So for my lessons for EdTPA, I chose my vocabulary assignment from content area, and I used that as lesson 1 because I thought it was important to introduce the vocabulary before the students really dug into the content that we were learning. So that was my first lesson. I went through and I had the students do like a think aloud process with the words and think about an image that could go with that word, and we drew that together. Guided practice, we played the memory game I made, and independent practice, we had an assessment. I gave them an assessment that was essentially the same. Memory is basically matching the term and definition, and the assessment was just a worksheet that matched the term and the definition. And then lesson 2, we went through the textbook together, the social studies textbook together, and I had students read the textbook and then read like a paragraph from each textbook talking about a certain explorer. After reading, then we had the students discuss important things about that explorer, so like where they traveled, where they're from, what they discovered. So we did that, and then as we discussed that, I made an anchor chart so that we could go back and refer to it later. And then for guided practice in lesson 2, I made a map. I had a map on the smartboard, and I mapped out one explorer. So we used where they went, we drew lines where they went, we put stars next to what they discovered, and then their independent practice was putting that on their own map and then adding all the other explorers we learned about onto that map. And then lesson 3, our class received mail. So our steps of instruction, we reviewed what we had learned about the vocabulary and about the content and the explorers. In our guided practice, I opened my letter and I went through a think aloud process of what my letter said, and I read it to the students, and then I thought about what the letter said that would make me think that a certain explorer wrote me a letter. So then when it came to independent practice for the students to get their own letters and read them, they would know that what they wanted to do or how to think through the process of who wrote them a letter. So they would take different aspects of the letter and put them together and say, okay, all of these things match what we learned yesterday about this explorer, so I believe that this explorer wrote my letter. And then we discussed who wrote their letters, who they think wrote their letters, and they had to argue why they thought that at the end. So for the rubric, I addressed goals and objectives in every lesson, and standards as well. Model subject-specific pedagogy, so I did that in lesson 2, which is mainly when I was teaching more content-specific. In steps of instruction, that's when we read through the textbook, talked about important aspects of each explorer, and then wrote it down on our anchor chart. So that's kind of where I talked about social studies and modeled social studies thinking for them and together as a class. I deepened learning and linked prior learning to new concepts in lesson 2 as well, and lesson 3, but mainly in lesson 2 I said, here's what we learned yesterday about our new vocabulary, and today we're going to connect the definitions for that vocabulary to our learning and our content, so while we're reading the textbook, we can understand what they're trying to tell us because we now have a new knowledge of these words. Connecting to personal assets. So in lesson 1, I introduced the lesson by asking if the students had ever read something in school or maybe in a newspaper where they didn't know what a word meant, and every person goes through this. If you're reading a book for your own enjoyment or for school or for work, and you're reading something and you don't understand a word, you're not going to understand the text. So I know that everyone has gone through that once in their life, and so I know that students go through that all the time. So that was connecting to personal assets. Modifying the lesson for target students' needs. So I have struggling students in my class, or struggling readers, I'm sorry. So on my memory game in lesson 1, every term card had a picture on it that matched the term, so that the struggling readers could look at the term, or look at the picture and say, okay, this is a slave, so this term must be enslaved. And then that allows them to connect the term and the definition together with a picture, which is also what we did in our instruction. So then questions to promote higher order thinking. I did this a lot in our closures. So I talked about what did we learn about, what new vocabulary words did we know, did we learn, what do we know now, what did we struggle with, if you excel in one area, how can you help others in another in that area who are struggling in that area. In lesson 2, we talked about who they put on their map, why did they pick that person to put on the map, and in lesson 3, we discussed who wrote their letters, why they think that person wrote their letters, and they had to argue their point of why they think that person wrote their letters. So they really had to do some critical thinking and make connections between what we've learned in previous days to now, and put those together to think about, well, it could be this explorer, and here's why. Assessment is connected to objective. My assessment for lesson 1 was the matching worksheet, which was connected to our memory game, and then it was also connected to the objective because my objective is I can match social studies vocabulary to their definitions. Establishes rapport and respect among students. In lesson 3, in independent practice, I said if you have any questions about your letter, come ask me, maybe I can help us sort through the issue. And then I said I'm excited to see who your letters are from, and then at the end I said those are some pretty cool letters. Did you guys enjoy getting letters in the mail from these explorers that we just learned about? And then models the strategy and engages students in learning. I did that throughout all 3 lessons. In lesson 1, I kind of did it during steps of instruction. So at the beginning I used a different word from a past unit, and I went through a think aloud, thinking through my process of the definition and connecting it to an image, picking an image and drawing it on the board. In lesson 2, guided practice was me showing them what they would do for independent practice and showing them how to go through that. In lesson 3, my guided practice was reading my own letter and doing a think aloud about, so here are different aspects of the letter. I'm pulling them together and looking at my anchor chart again and seeing who these all match to, which explorer they match to. And so that's why I believe this person wrote my letter. And that's